COBRA has been formed with a view to assisting businesses on a pro bono basis. Whilst business rescue is spoken of quite a bit, the idea around COBRA is to keep businesses out of rescue. So it's to avoid a rescue. In terms of the Companies Act, if a company is in financial distress, you have an obligation to put the business rescue to a vote. So there's a resolution that one has to put into place, and you've got to put that to a vote. So COBRA is about avoiding you having to vote. Whilst you have to put it to a vote, it's about you having to avoid voting in favor of business rescue. So the board of directors, they have an obligation to vote, and in fulfilling that obligation, they can say, no, we've decided to not put the company into business rescue. Why? Because we've got into the COBRA ecosystem. And the COBRA ecosystem is about the business rescue to give a reprieve, and then it's about having a whole panel. In fact, we've got over 24 companies now who've joined us, of experts to assist businesses who are in distress. So what happens is, obviously you have the legal framework, you have the actual business rescue practitioners, and then one has the experts who tap in. And that's what the CIDOG group are about. They are the experts who are going to come in around reimagining the new business models that are required in the post-COVID environment. So I'm going to ask my panelists. Yes, my panelists are ready. So
yes,
I'd like to invite Annalene. Annalene, I'll give you the floor.
Perfect. So let me just share my screen with you, and then Lorenzo Tenkati is just going to do a short introduction, and then I'll go straight into the information, given that we are short of time. So Lorenzo, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
I can hear you well. Okay.
Well, thanks everybody for joining. Apologies again for the short technical glitch. Singular, we are a management consulting firm, a global management consulting firm. And in the last couple of weeks, we decided to offer our help how we can to businesses around the world. And in particular, this is a South African focused webinar. And our attempt is very much one of providing sort of cutting through the chase and cutting through a hell of a lot of fake news and some folkloristic and exaggerated, in some cases, pieces of information that we read on the news, and try and guide as much as possible decision makers and the policy makers that want to follow our sort of our webinars and our report, which we issue weekly. In particular, we will look at three areas. One area is the impact that the virus has on the country and on the healthcare system, and what we learn from around the world and what can we reapply in South Africa. The second area is always looking at what could be the economic consequences of the virus to the South African economy, based also on the reaction of government. So we'll make scenarios. And then the third, and probably most interesting because it's the most proactive part, what can businesses do about it? And here, in this particular edition, we'll try and learn from what companies did in other crises, such as the financial crisis, and what kind of DNA components do we need to build in our own businesses to react successfully to this one. Annalene, okay. Let me pass it over to you.
Perfect. So if we go straight into it, as Lorenzo said, we have these three parts, and the first part is really us going very briefly but quantitatively unlocking how the virus could unfold in South Africa. So if I go straight into it and deep dive into the first section, I would like to begin by looking at South Africa's progress thus far. And what we can see is that, firstly, death is the best way to show progress, since it's less dependent on the testing capabilities of the country versus using an indicator such as the number of cases in that country. And what we can see here is that, looking at South Africa's death per million over time, it is much lower and much slower than other countries. So much so that it is following the trajectory of a good practice country like South Korea. So it's safe to say that South Africa has made good progress thus far. Okay. We move to the next slide. Okay. So now if we recap from our last webinar, what we have learned is that the virus is more widespread than what is reported. So much so that there are more and more countries, more and more medical studies that are starting to prove this. For every one case being reported, it's estimated potentially 4 to 7 cases actually go undetected. Now, this is due to the fact that there's lack of broad testing and that the fact that it takes 2 to 3 weeks to show symptoms of COVID-19. The key takeaway here is that given that the virus is more widespread, testing is ever more crucial to uncover these hidden cases and these asymptomatic cases. Okay. So the slide in front of you actually deep dives on this question. It deep dives on testing in South Africa. So the map in front of you actually shows South Africa, and it sits in the bottom left corner of the graph, meaning it has a low positivity. Okay, 3% of tests actually turn out to be positive. The global average is 8%. But our numbers have a high uncertainty because South Africa conducts 5 tests for every 1,000 people. The global average is 21 tests for every 1,000 people. Okay, so if you look at cases or countries that were in a similar position to South Africa a month ago, such as Norway and the UK, that were also in this bottom left corner a month ago. As they started increasing the number of tests, they started moving towards the right of the graph. Okay? And the reason why they do that is because as they do more tests, their positivity increases. So as they do more tests, they become better at detecting hotspots and detecting more cases. So we should expect a similar trend from South Africa in the short term.
Maybe let me just add to this that obviously the big question here is, will South Africa go the Germany and Norway way, or will South Africa go the UK way? And obviously we know we have a little history. You see that little green dot becoming, let's say, the little blue dot, which seems to have gone so far into some sort of diagonal way of, if you want, intermediate way vis-a-vis between Norway and the UK, but it's too early to say.
Perfect. As much as we need to start testing nationwide, I think what's crucial, if we go to the next slide, is about hotspots. So South Africa will need to start considering testing in hotspots specifically. So if you look at the slide in front of you, over the past 3 weeks, the Western Cape started attributing from 24% to 66% of South Africa's confirmed cases. And on this right-hand side, this little map of Cape Town, what's interesting is Khayelitsha, which is a semi-rural area, has seen its cases increase by 16 times in the past 3 weeks. So apart from us testing nationwide, testing and ramping up testing in these hotspots is also going to be crucial. Okay, next slide. So now let's start to deep dive on testing hotspots. So if we had to plot the number of tests needed to find a confirmed case, which we see in front of you now, what we can see is that typically in other countries, what tends to happen is that they first test very widespread. They do widespread testing. So it takes a lot of tests before they can actually find one confirmed case. Okay, so they start very high on this curve. But eventually you can see there's a dip. Okay, and the reason for this dip is that eventually they find hotspots. So they don't need a lot of tests to find a case because the virus is already spread and hotspots have developed. So they know where to target their testing. In countries like South Korea, in this graph, you can see that the graph picks up over time. And that's because they control the hotspots and then they go widespread again. But what's interesting in this graph is that South Africa doesn't have that dip yet. So we will need to monitor this and expect that potentially South Africa starts ramping up and concentrating testing in Cape Town and its hotspots.
Yeah, so I suppose maybe just to comment on this, I suppose there's still, again, also in this slide, we see that there is still a question mark outstanding for South Africa, in the sense that we would have expected by now probably this curve to start to dip as sort of the medical system, the healthcare system starts to become better at identifying hotspots, and cases, of course, increase. Now, we haven't really seen either of these two things, and that's why the line is still sort of roundabout straight. So again, something to be monitored, and something that we will probably understand better in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, perfect. If we move to the next slide and start thinking about scenarios that could unfold in South Africa, given that we expect infection rates to increase as lockdown is released, and that our infections could peak around June, there are 3 scenarios which could occur, whereby the infection rate increases from around 2 to 3 times compared to today. And that would mean a death range or fatality range of 350 to 1,300 by the end of July. In all 3 cases, critical bed capacity will be sufficient by the end of July. This is due to the curve flattening during our lockdown. So far, so good. Okay, so an interesting hypothesis that we would need to consider as we go into our winter period is the idea of a drier and lower temperature season, which potentially could accelerate the spread. Okay? So humidity and high temperatures have been proven to reduce the spread of the common flu, and scientists are still trying to prove this with COVID-19. But looking at this map, there could potentially be a correlation with the spread and severity of the virus versus climate. So it's also a good hypothesis to consider as we go into our winter season. Hey, so now that we've spoken about the healthcare and the virus spread, I think the next point that we need to make is, what does this mean on an economic level? So government could react in 3 ways. In the base case, which is this middle column in front of you, and it considered a peak in June, but two times the spread that exists today. Potentially, we could see a level 4 lockdown for 3 weeks and a level 3 lockdown for another 3 weeks. Okay. In the worst case scenario, that means our hotspots spread significantly. We don't ramp up testing there. We don't control these hotspots too much. We see potentially level 4 lockdown for equivalent of 4 weeks, and additional lockdowns in those hotspot areas, as well as a level 3 lockdown for another 4 weeks. Okay? And if we had to consider that on an overall economic impact, we are seeing a GDP retraction of around 10 to 17% in 2020. Okay, so year-on-year retraction. And if we think about that in terms of loss and recovery rate, so that means if we had to recover at least 80% of the loss that could happen due to COVID, it could potentially take us 5 to 7 years to recover that loss.
I mean, so this slide and these analyses, and that we'll also publish by sector. I don't know if we will go into the sector by sector now, but it's not to really sort of lay a doom and gloom, let's say, lay doom and gloom scenarios on everybody, but it's to really ensure that we take it seriously. 1 out of 5 people in the United States is out of a job as we speak, compared to the pre-COVID period, and we need to be realistic in the way we prepare for the years to come. So especially in certain sectors, but overall, in general for the economy. This is going to be a serious hit, and therefore we need to prepare our businesses in a way that we're prepared for a medium-term situation, not for a 2 to 3 months V-shape type of crisis.
Exactly. And if you look at the breakdown per sector, per industry that's in front of you, we built this estimation quite bottom up. And what's interesting is on the last row that's in front of you, if you look at hospitality is probably going to be the biggest hit that we see. And in terms of GDP contraction for hospitality, we're seeing something around 38 to 46% year-on-year retraction, which is quite significant.
Yeah, what's important is also to consider that, I mean, certainly we have a supply shock, which means that we have a constraint in the ability of certain businesses to supply due to the restrictions. But we will have obviously second degree and third degree effects as consumer spending decreases and business spending and business investments decrease due to the change in the perspective and perception of the future. So when we talk about contraction, for instance, in the mining sector, it's not so much or not only due to the supply constraints, due to the fact that the mines were closed, but it's also due to the fact that because demand at a global level will reduce, prices of commodities will go down, and therefore the income and the GDP per capita coming from the mining sector will go down.
Perfect. Okay, so we've given you a brief insight onto the virus spread. We've given you a brief insight into the economic effects, and now we're going to go into a few practical solutions that we see for businesses today. Okay, so we move to the next slide, and if you look at biological, social systems, and companies which have all experienced shocks, be it the 9/11 attack, be it earthquakes, be it a 2008 financial crisis. What is interesting is that we've noticed that these systems are typically made up of 3 building blocks. So if your organization was a house, and that house was built to survive a shock or an earthquake, it will be built out of 3 materials. So these 3 materials is 1, being responsive. So that's your ability to identify the immediate threat at your door today and react with speed. Material number 2 would be adaptivity. So that's your company's ability to transform your business in the longer term, pivoting the way you do your business tomorrow. And the third element is about thinking in ecosystems. And this is about your company's ability to create partnerships to the point that you can create an ecosystem which feeds you fast solutions and even creates redundancy in your business.
The speed of change and the complexity of the different areas in today's world is way too big for any single business to be able to adapt fast enough. So partnerships and, let's say, being able to draw from adjacent ecosystems is an absolute must in the winning recipe. We'll see some examples.
So if we take these building blocks, these 3 building blocks into practical terms, okay, and we take some case examples. So this is just a few case examples, but one example is Costco. So Costco was able to survive the financial crisis purely by responding very quickly. So it thought, let me make small amounts of revenue rather than making nothing at all. So it shifted its resources to areas of the business that could generate at least a minimum amount of revenue today. In this case, it was shifting its resources to cheaper, low quality products. It also said, let's do cost cutting. Let's do cost cutting everywhere. So it thought deep, but it also thought wide. Okay? It knew cash was king, and it started collecting pennies everywhere. So it actually reduced procurement costs by cost cutting on the non-essential spend, which every firm typically does, but it also did minor cost cutting changes at scale. So a very simple example is it started to change something as simple as a round peanut jar into a square peanut jar to reduce the packaging costs. But the thought process here is that it did a strategic and deep cost cutting. At the same time, it did a minor and scaled cost cutting. So it thought deep and it thought wide. The next interesting example is Fujifilm. And Fujifilm is an excellent story of surviving in the long term. Okay. So Fujifilm utilized its capability of anti-aging, preserving its camera film, to actually develop skincare which has the same anti-aging effect. Okay? And as a result, Fujifilm is around and not Kodak. The last case study is around Toyota, and Toyota used its Keiretsu, which is a network of interconnected suppliers, to actually create an ecosystem of knowledge to help them problem solve and source new material during a massive warehouse fire.
Annalyn, we have a suggestion to press actually view and full screen if you can, so that everybody can see the full, because I think there's a couple of borders that are out.
Okay,
or
sure.
Rohit.
Let me try one more time. So I go into reading mode. Is that better or the same?
I think view on top and full screen, try that.
Just zoom in a bit.
There we go.
Yeah, full screen mode. There you go.
Okay. Okay. So I think the last point that we want to leave you with is around, so taking these thought processes around adaptivity, being responsive, and creating these ecosystems. If we take the Costco example and we take the Toyota example and we try to think about this in practical terms, as an entrepreneur who's thinking about how do I survive this economic effect? So we've seen a very huge economic effect. We're seeing a possible 10 to 20% reduction of our GDP. How do we actually survive this? And as an entrepreneur, you need to start thinking about 4 key questions today to start surviving this. So the first question is, what are the short-term product changes that will sell today? Okay? So your customer is interested in spending money on just a few specific things today. And you need to figure out how you fit into that box. The second thought is around how do I cut costs, but how do I do it deep and wide? So I look at your whole cost restructure and try to figure out how do I pull pennies from each bucket. The third question is around adaptability. For you to start thinking about adaptability, you first need to figure out what are your core capabilities. Okay? These core capabilities can be very broad. For instance, a construction company has a core capability of project management. It has a core capability of being a construction regulator. So it's not just in the business of building buildings. So we need to try to understand what are these broad ranges of core capabilities and try to figure out how we could use that to pivot. And lastly, how can I connect, learn, and pull solutions from others? So time is critical during this phase. And instead of trying to rebuild and build from scratch, why not pull solutions, thoughts, and ideas from others so you can respond faster?
Just as an example, I mean, you see a lot of companies in Europe that actually are using existing last mile delivery infrastructure, the likes of Uber, Glovo, and so on and so forth, to actually distribute a whole number of other products. And obviously the first retailers that managed to do this, just to use the retail example, are the few ones that actually managed to convince governments to stay open because they were becoming essential. And those small revenues actually allow them to keep the employees on. And you can see how this virtuous cycle actually goes.
Okay, good. I think that's it presentation wise. We wanted to use or provide a longer platform to answer more questions. So I think the platform is open to any participants who would like to chat or pose any questions.
Yeah, please.
Can I jump in before the participants do?
Please.
This morning we were having a debate with CIDR Group, also on a webinar. And what I put to them was that in the current climate, what businesses possibly ought to do is to actually take their business model and scrap it and start from scratch. So in other words, take a business model, look at the future and decide how one would approach the future. But clinging on to old business models or old paradigms may in fact be a problem. Isn't it a case of us simply saying the old is old and now let's look to the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think, let's say, the answer to this question depends a lot on the extent to which your fixed costs burden you as a business. So in other words, if you don't want, for whatever reason, or you cannot cut a big chunk of your fixed cost, you need to absolutely find a way to have revenues in the short term that keep that alive. While in the meantime, so that adaptability and responsiveness need to happen in parallel. If you are a business that has the luxury of having very, very little fixed costs and or an operating margin that allows you to do so, you can actually start, use the experience of let's say, of a AAA company, but the thinking of a startup and actually rethink yourself from scratches. In my experience, typically most companies need to apply a mix where at the very least 2/3 of the effort is about pulling the old into some sort of version of new, and 1/3 of it maximum of the effort is into recreating from scratches. This is obviously a very big generalization, but I think it gives in a way hopefully the sense of the fact that it's kind of hard to leave the old behind.
And I think what's important, sorry, Annalene, before you get in there, but it's actually a point that you made, a very important point, and that's around Fuji and Kodak. Now, Kodak went under because they didn't adapt. I mean, the irony with Kodak was they were the first to invent the digital camera, and they did very, very little with it. The other examples of businesses who weren't in distress, who were able to change their path. Another one I can think of is Nokia. My understanding is they were a rubber or tire company, and they saw where the market was going, they saw new technology, and they went that way. So it's not necessarily, what I'm putting to you, it's not necessarily something that arises as a result of COVID, but obviously now we have to look very, very carefully at the future. And the point is the future is so opaque, it's so difficult to actually assess or to work on that new business model. Is that not so?
Yes, I mean, look, I think the key in this particular phase is really building flexibility into the system, in the sense that there's absolutely no way to know what the future. I mean, there's a few key trends that one can start thinking about, and I think if you think about the fact that the world of property and real estate will slightly change, and we'll have less probably. I mean, when it comes to healthcare, we'll have obviously a lot more attention in that space, and digital healthcare and e-learning and e-education will be a trend. So there are a few, let's say, broad stroke themes that we can, with little imagination, actually sort of foresee. But I think broadly speaking, there is a massive amount of uncertainty. So the winners in this scenario will be the ones that are able to adapt fast, to change fast. So to have the ability to actually serve different customer needs as these customer needs evolve over time.
I think, I know Annalene wanted to say something, so we'll get to you, Annalene, but I just want to make a point just around COBRA, because part of COBRA is the legal landscape, so that you can, in fact, start looking at the new models, and one needs breathing space, and COBRA is around giving you that breathing space and making sure that you can adapt, considering that you now are forced to adapt within the space of several months. And Aline, you were going to say?
Thank you, guys. I think the point that I wanted to make is what was so successful of Fujifilm versus Kodak in adapting was, one, is that they didn't do it immediately. So they tested immediately. So your first step when you're thinking about adapting your business model is to do a test on it. So invest a little, but test it very quickly. And once you see that test going, so once they made a minimum amount of revenue from this new business, that they start investing more dramatically over time. And the second point is that it's a good idea to think, okay, let's scrap the old business model and go into the new. But your new business model needs to be very close to your core capabilities, because your chances of success going into a brand new stream that's not close to your core capability is going to be much, much lower. So if you want to grow from your core, but very close to your core capabilities, because your chances of success is going to be faster or higher.
Yeah, this morning there was a key phrase by Roger, and he said, reimagine your business, but in doing so, do what you know.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
I mean, Fujifilm, for example, was in the business of anti-aging film and now is in the business of anti-aging skincare. So it's a technical skill that they adopted, but in a completely different light.
And please God, they get that right. Yeah, I don't see any questions. I'm hoping so. I just got to say to the attendees, please, what's important for us is that questions be posted. You know, I often say that it would be quite easy to simply pre-record a video and then post it and repeat it. And the idea behind webinars is that we do get that interaction. So if we can get the questions flowing, that would be great. You can post anonymously, or you can post, but if you want to have a private chat, we can also arrange that as part of the COBRA Pro Bono service. So if you want to actually have one-on-one with any of the guys at Singular, that can be arranged as part of their commitment to COBRA. I see we have, could you discuss the concept of deep and wide cost cutting? It's a question that's been posted. I don't know who wants to take that. Maybe put the screen off. It's got a speaker view.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's also a question on the presentation whether that will be available. Yes, it will be available. We'll actually share it on LinkedIn from our Singular group page. So the presentation will be available. So in terms of the concept of deep and wide cost cutting, I mean, here it's really about going into cash preservation mode everywhere and anywhere, just because nobody knows exactly the extent to which or the length of let's say the suffering in the beginning because of the supply constraint, and then most likely because of the curbing of demand. So here the point being is that it's about changing the mindset of the company and making sure that it becomes into everybody's mind and into everybody's sort of DNA and into the company's culture to look at cash preservation and cost cutting initiatives, however small they are. I mean, if you think about retail, and that's the example that Annalene was making before with Costco. I mean, these are industries that work at very thin margins on a normal day. So the moment you hit a massive iceberg like COVID-19, that small margin is immediately into the negative. So it's not going to be enough to just do one or two or three big, let's say, quick win cost-cutting measures. You need to really change completely the way that the company thinks about cash preservation and cost-cutting. Typically, that is done most successfully when it's also tied into the incentive systems. So in other words, you need to, first of all, create an example of these types of behavior that typically requires evocative stories and or sort of examples that come from the top of how leaders, how you as a leader, as a CEO, stopped driving your Mercedes and went on your bakkie from the post-COVID era, for argument's sake, to make a symbolic change that comes from the top. And then that should translate into also a reward system that slowly but surely rewards the behaviors that you actually want to incentivize. So in other words, if cash preservation is what you want, and if what you want is in cost cutting, and if what you want is creativity applied to that because you want to go beyond the quick wins, then typically you need to also change your let's call it your bonus and remuneration incentive system.
It's almost like I would describe it as a cost-cutting culture, because you can do the deep cost-cutting strategically with your head office, but if you want to get scale to take it to the next level, that's, as Lorenzo is describing it, it's a culture.
Annaline, let me ask you this. We're looking at, I mean, a lot of what you're saying is move to variable. Do you foresee, I mean, would you recommend that variable expenses be achieved now, obviously, because that'll see one through the pandemic, but post-COVID, I mean, surely one should stick to a flexible expense situation in light of the fact that this has happened and can happen again?
Yeah, look, so sorry, go ahead, Lorenzo.
Go for it.
No, I was just about to say, so variable pay or variable expenses is a short-term solution that is going to, it's your quick win that you should do as a response now, 100%. I think if you want to go into a long-term cost-cutting culture or a medium-term cost-cutting sort of structure, you need to make structural changes. So there's structural cost-cutting that you need to do. And these structural changes is like revamping your operating model. These structural changes is about thinking the way you do your scheduling and your labor shifts. There's different structural changes that you'll need to do in your organization, as well as these ideas that Lorenzo has been talking about, where you need to remunerate and drive and promote a cost-cutting culture so that you can get these little costs, but on a wide scale. So I think that's the difference. The variable pay itself, or the variable expenses itself, is really a short-term solution that's not going to be sustainable with your suppliers in the long term.
Thanks. I see we have questions.
Yeah, we have some questions. So the first question, do you see sources of suppliers of capital shifting in dominance, i.e. away from banks and exchanges and more from PE and high net worth or ultra high net worth individuals or sovereign wealth fund, or whom? Well, I mean, I think certainly one thing that we will see, at least in the medium term, is a lot of investment from private equities. I mean, purely because private equities have hoarded cash in the pre-COVID environment. And to a broad extent, those are fixed commitments. They're typically 10-year commitments from their limited partners. So they will be allowed, let's say, the benefit of having a relatively long period of time to deploy that capital without being under pressure from the markets. Corporates typically don't have that much of that much flexibility, because of course if your share prices decreases, if your profit decreases, then your ability to use bank debt also gets impaired. So I would say yes, we will see some shifts in the medium term. I don't think it's going to be necessarily a long-term thing. I think what we will see in my point of view, at a country level, is we'll definitely see a shift from countries, or let's say a shift of power towards countries that are able to manage the let's say the post-lockdown, the new normal better, and secondly, that are able one way or another to cushion society with spending. So countries like the US and China, unfortunately for countries like South Africa, for instance, and many other countries, I think will have an advantage, because they are able to borrow more and to spend more and to cushion more the society, and therefore limit to some extent the let's say the depth of the recession. The second question that I read, which sectors may have to better which sectors may have to better digitize their business models and faster? I mean, it's hard to say exactly which ones will be forced immediately, but if you think about the ones that will hit immediately very critical stages, for sure, hospitality, real estate, and retail. So when I talk about real estate, I'm talking about more the commercial side of real estate. And when I think South Africa specifically, uh, these will have to think long and hard very, very quickly. And I think it's going to be a mix of digital and brick and mortar. So you'll see a lot of reconversion of space from, for argument's sake, retail to kitchen space, from retail to warehousing, so that you enable the last mile delivery of the large number of online delivery products and online e-commerce that will develop. So you'll see a lot of hybrid models and models that will evolve into because I mean, let's remember that if you own a chain of hotels, you cannot really go digital the day after. You're still stuck with a hell of a brick and mortar footprint that you need to do something with. So I think there's going to be a mix of evolution between using your brick and mortar and fixed cost and capital infrastructure in a different way or partly in a different way, and then adding a digital layer on top, which will either make your operations more efficient or will create a new, for instance, sales channel in the case of e-commerce. Okay.
Here's another question.
So regarding cost-cutting culture, do you risk undermining other parts of the business by building this cost-cutting culture? For example, quality, which might push the business into distress from another point of view, and how would you mitigate that risk? Yeah, I think certainly that is a risk, in the sense that you can always go too far in any direction. So I would say the moment you start, but typically you see that happening hopefully you see that happening first in a small and gradual way, and you're able to stop it, in the sense that, let's say, you give too harsh, let's say, procurement cost-cutting measures to your procurement department, and you start buying products of lower quality. I think there should be mechanisms in place that first of all look at total cost of ownership and not only purchase price, but also that check the quality on an ongoing basis in a way that you don't change the quality of your ultimate end product. So I mean, I think there's no real easy answer to this, but I would say it is definitely a risk. It is definitely to be monitored and managed. We've seen so many companies going from one extreme to the other.
I'll ask you something, Lorenzo. You made the comments around repurposing of retail property. Where do you see Sandton City in 5 years' time?
I mean, my general gut feeling would be that the properties that are more, let's say, energy efficient and cheaper to run will be the ones that will probably stay, let's say, in business, and will likely be repurposed, or let's say partitioned, not necessarily repurposed. So in other words, if you were needing an office that was 300 square meters, now you probably are very happy to offer a more flexible model in the post-COVID world, and you may be happy with a 150 square meter office. So what that might mean is that Sandton will be partitioned into smaller office spaces. Where I see more reconversion will be in the least efficient spaces that are marginally higher on the, let's say, let's call it the cost curve when you look at the operating costs. And those spaces, I think, will either be reconverted into affordable housing or potentially, depending on where they are located, into, I mean, you'll see, I think we'll see a lot of hospitality models that run on what they call the dark kitchen model, whereby you have effectively a big kitchen, and the restaurant only exists online and gets delivered through Uber Eats or what have you. and then warehousing will be another, let's say.
That's what I just want to interject there, and that's what COBRA's been doing. So with a lot of the franchises and a lot of the businesses in distress that have come into COBRA, what's happened is we call it a ghost kitchen model, and a lot of the practitioners, particularly engaged guys, are moving the guys onto a ghost kitchen because that's what's allowed at the moment. So that's already happened, Lorenzo. It's
absolutely.
It's
You see
that's happened overnight.
Absolutely. I mean, businesses are fast. I mean, the beauty of capitalism has a lot of, let's say, downsides, but the beauty of it is that it's generally rather quick in terms of like reaction times. The fastest in the business, they make changes very, very quickly. So another question: should companies opt for salary sacrifices, middle management and above, instead of retrenchments, considering the risks of adding to the vulnerable? I think so. I mean, I think in my point of view, I mean, the general company, then obviously every company is different, but let's say the average company will not solve its problem by cutting top managers' salary, but I think it goes a very long way in terms of setting a message and telling a story, and a story of sacrifice that we all need to do, and of resilience that we are. So we are preparing for the worst, and the worst starts from the top rather than from the bottom. So I don't think that will be the solution, but I think that will be an excellent symbol, an excellent, let's say, storytelling mechanism to ensure that you carry the organization through the crisis. And if you need to retrench, the other people that stay do understand, and the people that get retrenched do understand that it was needed for the survival of the business. It was not about letting people or leaving people behind.
I think the answer of the cost of the pay cut or the salary cut is more for buy-in. So if you're transparent with your team and you're transparent of the financial situation and you make this first sacrifice as management, it's your buy-in for the sacrifices that are going to come in the future. So it's more for buy-in should the retrenchment happen.
There's another question that I think we partly addressed from Gabri about the excess space, especially in the office space in the short to medium term, exacerbated by companies simply closing or scaling down. I think I addressed to some extent that I think there will be a lot of threats for these landlords and a lot of opportunities for reconversion, whether it's warehousing, whether it's retail with a strong, let's say, multi-channel focus, so with a strong delivery and online e-commerce focus, whether it's warehousing that you need to actually perform those deliveries. Dito for shopping malls, although the longevity of malls in South Africa was already under threat from increasing online shopping and deteriorating economy, would low-cost, high-density living space be a solution for office space? Would retirement accommodation with treatment facility be a solution for malls, at least proportionately? I think so. I think there is a big opportunity. You know, if you think about the affordable housing, if you want, gap, and already started trend, I think will just be sort of shifting gear and increasing in speed. And I mean, about retirement accommodation, in South Africa, I think we have a relatively young population, so it'll certainly happen, but probably not at a big scale just because of numbers. But I think in Europe, this will be extremely prevalent. Huh?
Can I also ask something else, which has not been dealt with, and I think is really, really important, and I want to know whether you factored this into your thinking, and that is that historically social discord has come with situations such as the present. You'll see historians will say that the Nazi Party emerged as a result of the 1929 depression. Now, have you factored that into your thinking, the social discord? We're talking, I read this morning, The Economist, 25% unemployment in America, and I read another article, 50% in South Africa. The consequences of that on your business. Can you comment on that?
Yes. I mean, I think it's definitely going to be a big test for humanity. So I definitely think, I mean, I think we should all try to be, let's say, optimistic, but we shouldn't be, let's say, superficial. So I think this is going to be a big test, and how countries will handle it will determine to what extent you create the level of frustration that could, become racism, or increase racism, increase hatred for minorities or whomever. And if you think about this in the context, so I would even take one step back. I think we already were running a dangerous path in this respect, because if you think about Brexit, you think about the Trump administration to some extent, you think about other European governments. I mean, a lot of the voters that sort of led those events to happen, and those, let's say, candidates to win, were actually very frustrated by the increasing inequality that we've seen in the last 20 years, where basically the if you want, the blue collar category in developed economies lost a substantial amount of purchasing power. So in a way, this comes at a time where already we have some underlying, let's say, undealt with issues. So I think I can only hope for the best, and I like the rhetoric that the president is sort of instituting in South Africa, but I think it's there is a substantial risk.
Well, I think what you're essentially saying is that the risk began prior to COVID and then maybe exacerbated. When we talk of risk, I assume you're talking about the populism that's emerged over the last decade.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Populism and the general sort of increase in inequality, which caused the expression of which basically was, in some cases populism, in some cases nationalism, in some cases isolationism, and so on and so forth.
What do you make of government's comment that they'll use this as an opportunity for radical economic transformation?
I think it's a big opportunity. I mean, on paper, I think it's a lot easier than in practice, but I think it is a big opportunity, because if you think about the type of, let's say, reforms that typically institutions like the International Monetary Fund, let's say, enforce or prescribe, attached to funding lines, I mean, typically those could facilitate the agenda of a reformist, let's say, ruling party that would otherwise struggle to get through, let's say, approvals and in-party infights. So I think on paper it's a fantastic opportunity. In practice, it might probably prove more difficult than in theory, but I think on paper it's a great opportunity.
Lorenzo, haven't we seen that already? I mean, socialism, in a sense, has already emerged. I mean, we're seeing online free activities that would never have been free 3 months ago. So there has been that shift.
Yes. No, I think so too.
We have another question, guys.
Yeah.
So given global value chains being dominated by multinationals, do you see them slowing down in South Africa and Africa, or pulling out in the flight from risk, or the opposite, given frontiers of opportunity? I think this is the kind of question that requires a double reading.
So I think a key point here around value chains being linked to multinationals. So there's two things that we are seeing in our study in terms of change along global value chains versus local value chains. And the first thing that we see is that there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction to China, very naturally. And you can see that by Japan today. So Japan has recently announced that it will invest like $2 billion USD just to get their multinational organizations out of China. So there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction. We don't foresee that as being a long-term reaction, but we do see, and Cyril Ramaphosa has already been talking about this in the last State of the Nation address, the idea of doing some reshoring at specific areas of the value chain where there is opportunity. That being said, if you look at, for instance, certain industries like refining in the mining industry, it's very much linked to the cost of doing business in South Africa. Like our electricity costs are quite significant and very unreliable. So for us to actually start investing further down the value chain to secure this reshoring and this local supply means we need to change our infrastructure today. So there's risk, but there's opportunity.
I'm gonna. Sorry, before you carry, allow Lorenzo to finish off. Then I'll deal with Gabri's question. So sorry, Lorenzo, I interrupted.
No problem. I just wanted to add the fact that I think the let's say especially in Africa, I don't see necessarily a big, let's say. I don't see necessarily a big threat for big multinationals, but the problem I see is that the demand that those big multinationals will be, let's say, appealed by, could be shattered for a few years. So, in other words, it's for me the biggest variable here is really about the ability to cushion the economy and make sure that demand doesn't get completely suppressed for a lot of years to come. And that in turn depends on the ability to pull in from basically government support, which in turn hopefully gets complemented by international financial institutions.
I'm going to ask you, there's a great question here by Gabri. Ditto for shopping malls, although the longevity of malls in SA at least was already under threat from increasing online shopping and deteriorating economy, would low-cost, high-density living space be a solution for office space? Would retirement accommodation with treatment facilities be a solution for malls, at least proportionally? Now, there are two elements to the question. And the first is just high-density living space. And in my mind, and I'm going to put this to the panelists, there's a paradox, because high-density living space is designed to be close to retail and close to offices. But now that retail and offices are offline, what comes of high-density living space? So in answering this question, I'll ask that you also deal with that.
Yes, I mean, I tried to touch upon it before. I think it's, in my view, we'll see a bit of both, to be honest. So we'll see a lot of the, let's say, a lot of the office space and retail space will have to be repurposed, and a mix of the. I mean, these two are very good candidates for the repurposing. So I see a mix of that happening. I would expect that.
But the point is to what? What does one repurpose a building to if retail and commercial is dead? So resident, I'll tell you where I'm going with this, Lorenzo, is that there's been a lot of talk around ruralization. So we've had in the industrial age urbanization. We've seen that over the last 250 years. And now there's been a lot of talk about ruralization as a result of technology. And an example that's been given is 3D printing. In 3 years, 3D printing is going to be such that all you do is you pay for the design of Nike shoes and it gets printed. So the question I really have is this not the first step towards that ruralization that a lot of people have been speaking of? Because you don't need to live in a close to offices any longer or close to retail any longer. We're going to have drones delivering our groceries to us.
I think we'll certainly see a trend, let's say, most likely a long-term trend of, let's say, going away from urbanization, in the sense that a lot of factors, whether it's pollution, which we've seen already causing some political, let's say, trouble to the party, even in China, and now COVID will just speed that up. So I think, yes, we will see a change in that mega trend. I don't think it will be something that will happen in the short term, but I think it will be a substantial medium-term trend. So medium to long-term trend. So I don't exclude at all that a lot of space slowly but surely will become actually abandoned, or will be reconverted into parks. It is a possibility. I don't see that happening in the very short term, but I do see certainly a mega trend in the long term.
I would describe the medium term trend as decentralization, not ruralization, but more like a decentralization that we see happening already in South Africa today.
There has been talk, incidentally, and we're way over time, but there has been talk. They're saying that now the drones, the helicopter that's been designed and has come into operation now in Dubai, it's a drone copter that allows for your pickup and delivery of you as a person to work in circumstances where you can get to work that's 30 minutes away, but 200 kilometers away. And there's also that impact, but that's technology. That's not COVID, so that's for another day.
Yeah, but what's interesting about this point, sorry to continue on this, is that South Africa is going to be better at this than the Western world because of our decentralization, because of our scattered population, and the need to transport and deliver and communicate widespread. And a good example of this that's happening in a COVID situation is Senegal. So Senegal sees the scattered situation, and they're faced with malaria all the time, that they're using drones today to supply to provide medical supplies to the remote areas of the population. So if anything, if this happens, Africa would be much better equipped for it because they're already innovating in that direction already.
I've got to ask you one final question, sorry, and it's a personal question, but I've been toying on this, but I've got Singular on the line, so I have to make use of this, so apologies. In my mind, rating agencies, the downgrade to South Africa is actually, it's a fiction, because ratings are relative. It's countries relative to one another. So you take the America relative to South Africa, or country A relative to country B. Now, if you do not know where country A is going to be, okay, in the next 6 months, how can you rate country B?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the problem is that it all, at the end of the day, boils down to confidence. So, there are different metrics, of course, behind it that the different agencies use, which are quite, let's say, standardized. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to confidence. So if you think about what happens when COVID hits, the dollar strengthens. Even if the Fed, the Federal Reserve, is actually printing trillions and trillions of dollars. So in other words, what that tells you is that it is very much a matter of who has the confidence of other countries that they will pull out, and they have the ability to borrow from the system, from the remainder part of the system. And in this context, I mean, this is certainly a condition that puts America and China at a very, very big advantage. And if Europe was able to coordinate a bit better than it is, also for Europe would be the case. So on the one hand, it seems cruel, and it seems let's say also a little bit fictional. On the other hand, unfortunately, smaller systems and smaller economies, especially the ones that don't have full control of their monetary system, are at a disadvantage, and therefore they get downgraded. I mean, in the case of South Africa, the good news is that South Africans' debt is only to a very small or relatively small percentage in foreign currency denomination. So that actually helps the country having the ability of printing more money and helping the economy and sustaining the economy. So that, I think, is a good let's say positive for South Africa vis-a-vis other emerging countries that have actually a lot of their debt in foreign currency.
But now that you've dealt with the printing of money and the disparity, that's where that then goes back, I guess, to the Gini coefficient, if you want, in economics, or the fact that there will be social strife as a result of this. It's because of the disparity, and there's going to be probably, and I'll again ask you to comment, further social strife as a result of that. I mean, one country can print money, another can't. I mean, how does one deal with that in a global economy?
I think you're right. I think it's I mean, the comment is very right, and unfortunately is descriptive of the reality. The countries that are able to print money and are able to outspend themselves out of the crisis will come out at an advantage. So that works at a country level, and it also works at a subsystem level and at an individual level. So in other words, in countries where you have high inequalities, without any material significant government interventions, those inequalities are typically bound to increase, not decrease, precisely for the same factor or for the same mechanism at a micro scale that you see at a macro scale from country to country. So I think it's sad, and it's let's say, if you want, it feels unjust, but it's the way it's going to work. And actually, maybe one comment that I think, one thing that we will see out of this crisis is certainly possibly the increase in relevance of governments, because the world will learn that without governments and without government intervention, when certain distortions happen, like the one you just mentioned, the world just becomes ever more unequal. So in a way, I think this will certainly be, or I would hope it will be, one of the learnings that comes out of this crisis.
Lorenzo, I don't know if you read The Economist this morning, but there's an article that deals precisely with that point, and they concur with what you just said, that this is now about government, that this is an opportunity for governments to shine. And yeah, the article mirrored what you just said. So I'm not sure if you read the article, but you're spot on.
I didn't read the article, and I promise I will not ask them for copyright.
Thanks so much. This has been fantastic. This is, as always, it's been over the last 3 weeks. We've had Singular joining us at COBRA, providing with a presentation, their insights. As you can see, I get excited. We're 15 minutes over schedule because, I mean, yeah, the insights are just incredible. So thank you for joining. Bear in mind that we have these every single day. We have targeted webinars, and I'll make sure, without a shadow of a doubt, that Singular on next week. So please be here for that. Thanks all. Thanks
guys, for next week. Please feel free to chip in questions that relate to your specific business if you wish. We're very happy to contribute as much as we can and make it as helpful as possible for you, rather than a monologue in the direction that we think could be useful.
And yeah, and assisting is the COBRA pledge. Thanks for that. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, COBRA.